All right. Welcome back to the podcast uh, where we talk about the inheritance of Europe, what it means to be European, up and down the centuries. Right now, we're at the phase where we're talking about post-World War II up until uh, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Iron Curtain. I uh, I want to introduce my co-host, Evan Loganov, as he talks about events, basically starting right after the end of World War II with VE Day in Europe and the downfall of Nazi Germany and the National Socialist Republic there. Yes, so putting like perspective, like uh, Germany was divided into in Austria were divided into four different uh, quadrants, and Berlin itself was also divided into four different quadrants, sectors really, and part of it was Soviet controlled, as was like all of East Germany, which is a northeastern part of the Federal Republic of Germany now, and and so that was part of the Federation, um, or communist, socialist republic, right? And then the rest of it was, had its capital not in Berlin but in Bonn, and that was NATO allied basically. And at this point, obviously, NATO springs into action, trying to organize against, the Soviet Union principally, and Germany is a big part of that. But Berlin is weirdly this enclave. It's like it's not. You have to fly in to get there. You can't take rail. You can't take car on the highway. You literally have to fly in or fly out. And because of this, there's a huge crisis with provisions for the residents there, and because half of it is still Western, and actually that the Western half for a while right after World War II, but eventually it just changed. But for a while it was French controlled and British controlled, and I believe American controlled as well, or German controlled. And so it was kind of a free for all up until a point. But this is around the time of the Potsdam Conference, where the the decision to sort of divide Europe in not in half, but between West and East, communist and capitalist, or liberal democracy, or whatever, that basically was decided at Potsdam. It has a forerunner with the Yalta Conference, but Yalta was a little bit more about wartime, whereas this was about political, factors that would be put into motion for the rest of the 20th century. It stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was the forerunner for a lot of different organizations that in the modern world. Like there's one that's for Southeast Asia, there's one for South America, one's for the Arab world, one is for Africa. It was the first sort of like multinational organization that colluded against rival powers around the world, and it's still around today, of course, very famously. The one thing I want to say is interesting about the Deutsche Mark is that after originally they had the Reich mark, and they changed it to the Deutsche Mark because it sounded less authoritarian. But it's just funny how they changed the name of their currency based off how it sounds. Because Reich means like rule, right? So they didn't want it to sound authoritarian, so they changed it to Deutsche Mark, which just means uh, you know German. The Warsaw Pact was less of an organization by itself because it was all centrally controlled from Moscow. But the Warsaw Pact was sort of like a synecdoche for their version of NATO and the Eastern Bloc. And the French were the colonial power that tried to keep its grip on Vietnam. It wasn't like America, where Americans sort of played crusader and like invaded for a period of time. The French literally like resided there and thought it was like their right to rule over because they had done so for decades. Yeah, Algeria. Believe at the end of the conflict, there's a lot of propaganda going around that Algeria was basically France, and that they should be regarded as French, not regarded as African or Algerian or Arab speaking or whatever, Berbers. They should be regarded as French. And I think it's very telling about the way the foreign policy in France, the French government was, and how they were seemed to be far more inclusive about their national identity than the British. It was a pretty bitter conflict. Yeah, it's my understanding that they didn't control that West African sort of plateau and the Sahara and all that. They didn't control that super region for as long as you might think. The British, yeah, like the British were the foremost organizer of colonies, and then the French kind of like tacked on their colonies after, because they were sort of a getting cozy with the British, and they had more foreign policy influence, foreign affairs influence later on. But yeah, no, I'm not surprised that the French lost so many colonies, because I didn't think that they had a tradition of settling the way that the British did. Yeah, it's funny that De Gaulle wasn't. Well, it's funny to compare him to Churchill, right? Because De Gaulle was like considered a war hero, but he didn't really lead like full armies the way, because he was just part of the resistance. Whereas, so during the Algerian conflict, like it makes sense that it wouldn't work under his supervision. But, but what's interesting with Churchill, or you still have more to say? Clement Attlee took over at Churchill, even though Churchill was like this dignified superstar. But he just didn't. He didn't. No one thought his politics were liberal enough. They thought he was too conservative, essentially. Similar to the New Deal. See, but to be fair, though, the New Deal was kind of that was happening, on multiple levels in the West. What did they nationalize? Like the like exactly the railroads and what services and stuff. And it is true that Stalin, his own advisors like Beria and Khrushchev, and they were terrified of him. and they had to like pretend to be like his friend 24/7, and if they disappointed him, they could get sent to the gulag. So if they would, every joke that Stalin made, they had to laugh at it. You know, this is all documented. That like that they were like basically brown nosing to Stalin, his own advisors, trying to placate him constantly at this point because he was so sensitive to any criticism. And apparently Stalin played pool like very well, and he would play cards and watch movies with his advisors, like the cabinet. But they were all just terrified of him. They just wanted to take his job essentially. And during this whole process, he was sending people to the gulag left and right, having people killed. You know, it's very very paranoid behavior. Yeah, he's a dark figure. And he like Hitler and Himmler were not friends. And so Stalin and Beria weren't really friends either. They sort of, it was this odd working relationship between like a very demented underling and then like a very like paranoid like a superior. And when Beria was arrested, when Stalin died, Beria was arrested by Zhukov. And Zhukov famously was like sent out to like, you know, the Ural Mountains by Stalin. For those who don't know, Zhukov was like the war hero general of Stalingrad and Moscow and invading Berlin. He was like he's sort of like the Eisenhower of the Soviet forces, their star general. But Stalin was so terrified of him because he knew that he represented strength and all these good qualities, and so he was terrified that Zhukov would like replace him at some point. And so he had ordered Zhukov to be sent out to like these random parts of the Soviet Union, just so he could get him as far away from him as possible. But once he dies, he's allowed to come back to Moscow. And what does he do? He arrests Beria um, personally. Personally, he throws his hands up against the wall. Later on, Beria ends up getting shot in the fucking street because he was a convicted rapist. Yeah, he was murdered by his own by people that were supposed to be working for him. Yeah, I think there was obviously there wasn't a lot of like publications on like killing sprees and mass murders by the government, but there's just a suspicion about the way things are run. And there were occasional like slip ups where like 20 citizens would have been killed by the soldiers or whatever, paramilitary or whatever, but very rarely. That was actually pretty rare in the Soviet Union. It was more peaceful than people think it is generally. And actually, people really looked down on Stalin during that period. But eventually, when Brezhnev takes over again, Yuri Brezhnev, they from after well after Khrushchev, like several other general secretaries later, he actually I believe he reinstigates this like a appraisal of Stalin because Stalin won World War II. So, hey, you might have your criticisms, but Stalin won World War II. And Tito, by the way, who ran Yugoslavia, did not like Stalin, and for a long time, he actually he tried to Tito was what's it called? Tito was instrumental in developing like a sort of a third nonpartisan sort of view, again, not Western, but not really Soviet, because Tito was like a national folk hero, and like like one of the most celebrated leaders in the Eastern Bloc. But because of his opposition to Stalin, he ended up sort of carving a path for his own people in a very unique way, and he was a trendsetter because of that. But and then obviously, before that, or around actually, well, around the, I mean, sorry, not before that, after that, during Khrushchev, you have the Hungarian uprising, which is what you're about to, in Budapest, which is what you'd say. It reminds me a little bit of Ukraine right now. It has the same dynamic though. Oh, interesting. The and this is all in Budapest, by the way. And I saw footage on this recently, and they had, they were like, people were like, oh, it's so horrible, what's going on? Like, look at this body, and they're pointing, look, the journalist, pans over to a dead body of a woman, and they're like, this is what we're going through right now, and it's just like they were just basically, it wasn't like a full blown war, but they were like they were fighting, like it was no joke. Oh, he was another guy that was one of Stalin's cronies that didn't really like him, but just pretended to. Actually, I believe Molotov's wife was imprisoned by Stalin for like years and years and years. That could be someone else, but there was a crony of Stalin's who like had to like pretend to like him for like decades, but at the same time he like imprisoned his wife for like the same amount of time. Oh yeah, yeah. Around the same time, this doesn't have this indirectly has to do with the Soviet Union. It's more about Britain, but definitely about Egypt. There's the Egyptian leader Nasser, Gamal Nasser. He decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, which was sort of the major trade, cargo, uh, a conduit, to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. And formerly it was a little bit like Gibraltar. It had this sort of like Western, control, quote unquote. But then it was seized and nationalized by the Egyptian government, and this caused a huge crisis that was more economical than military. I mean, not like it wasn't like people were dying left and right, but what ended up being a consequence of this was that the English and the French didn't get their way for one of the first times in modern Egyptian history, and then the United Nations had to come in and sort of be really like the liaison, because and this was sort of the first time the United Nations had to do anything of any consequence. One of the very earliest instances. It's a very big issue, and the Americans, interesting enough, they were sort of using this as a proxy issue. Financially speaking, they're using it as a proxy conflict between the Soviets, who wanted to support Egypt, and then the English and French, who didn't, and the Americans sort of didn't know what to think. So they ended up supporting the Egyptians and the Algerians just because they wanted them to be on their side, and it's a very interesting situation. No, and you see this really taking off when later on Egypt um, absorbs Syria and goes to war with Israel, which is itself a proxy war of many elements, and you have the Arab Israeli wars, and Yom Kippur War, 6 Days War, or whatever. It's like, yeah, it has a precedent in the Crimean War, but in this era, this was the first sort of instance of this. Yeah. And the other thing was that the Israelis occupied the Sinai Peninsula, which we know is today is like an Egyptian piece of land, and that was sort of their version of taking. The Egyptian government takes the Suez Canal. Well, the Israeli government will take the Sinai Peninsula. It ended up not working, but and you know how long it took? It took to the Camp David Accords in the late '70s with Jimmy Carter, and presiding over it, and that was kind of Jimmy Carter's big like hurrahs. Was one of his big hurrahs was presiding over the Camp David Accords. And then at that point, you get this feeling that the French and the British don't really have a lot of say there if they're relying on an American to be the liaison. Also, France. Well, before we get into Sputnik and the space race, which you probably know more about than I do, uh, I wanted to say a couple notes about Korea and Lebanon, because Lebanon was a French, like Syria. It was part of the French Empire, and they ended up getting sort of kicking the French out. Although even today, there's still like a cultural influence there. And then in Korea, like Vietnam, there wasn't a strong colonial presence, but it was the first time that NATO sent like European forces along with American forces into East Asia to sort of continue to fight against communism in a proxy war. And it was a lot of people died there. So my grandfather ended up being being an officer in the Korean War. But yeah, it's a lot of people died fighting for against communism, and they actually were fighting against the Chinese, amongst not just the North Koreans. And they figured that out kind of late. They figured the Soviets figured out nukes. Was it not? Is it 46 or was it 4? It wasn't until after the war that they figured out nuclear technology capability. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's also a brain drain in Germany at this time to the west and to the east. And the head of the NASA program was famously like a Nazi factory owner, Werner von Braun. So there's a lot of brain drain because they developed the V2 rockets in Germany during the war, which was, despite being a military implement, was the predecessor to both space programs. And this was before the euro. They didn't have the euro when they did this. This was more, yeah. Well, then, yeah, I think there's a predecessor to this with a dumb name called the European Coal and Steel Community, and but that was basically infrastructure targeted, and what were utilities, infrastructure, and commodity resources, and that's kind of like what you need to keep society afloat in this period is those three factors. So I think like with a globalizing world and it's entering into a postmodern, post-service culture and economy, you really do need to make sure economies are under lock and key. Sorry, commodities and infrastructure is under lock and key. Yeah, sorry, but yeah, you can go. Oh yeah, yeah. There's a lot of good art that comes out in this period, and there's a parallel, I think, with the civil rights movement in the United States. I think goes on in Europe with the in what in Ireland. Well, I was going to say one thing real quick is that if we're talking about the British Isles, they had skiffle in the 50s, which was sort of like uh, white musicians copying American artists because they weren't really copying Soviet artists because of the whole like censorship and misinformation and people not getting access to what was going on over there. So they had a lot more access to the freed up United States, and they had a lot of black blues players, black jump blues, art, rhythm and blues. Rock and roll was created in the 50s, and so the artists in Europe copied um, a lot of the American artists, black and white, like country singers and stuff, but they copied them, and they sort of integrated all that into their own culture which was really a novelty because Europe typically didn't care about American music or filmmaking or anything, theater. And the UK was one of the main exponents of this sort of assimilation. The other thing was to remember is that India stops being a colony of the UK, and because of that, there's an attitude about India that shifts. Indian culture, Eastern, Near Eastern culture, becomes more something that can be fetishized and less something that's looked down upon. And so because of that, you get all the the hippies and the LSD and the Maharishis and all the this fascination with hemp and tie dye and door beads and what's it called, the mandala prints. It's just all this goofy art that's very much Near Eastern. I'm not surprised. Also, like high taxes are associated with rich cultural output for some reason, and not just in London, and also the Beatles. This is all over England. The Beatles started out in Liverpool, and they're kind of from a rough area, and then the Stones were from London, but the Stones were actually had like more well-to-do than the Beatles were. But the irony is that the Beatles sort of came across as a posh band, and the Stones sort of had this edge to them, but like blues based. But it's just ironic there. And then, but that's just how people are. They play to their opposites. And then in France, they had a lot of crooner like singers. They didn't really catch on to the Beatles in France, and it took a while. It took until basically after the Beatles broke up for a lot of the European countries to actually accept them as weighty in popular music. Second Vatican, yeah, very liberalizing reforms. Yeah, man. Yeah, there's also a move again, away, not against, but a move away from Catholicism in Europe. People becoming more irreligious, and there's also a move away from Protestantism that runs in parallel. The free love associated with the hippies, and before that they had the mods and the rockers or the groups, and they this was part of sort of this delinquency culture that was taking form for the first time because of um I think it's because they are tired after World War II. There's this angst of like, what do we do with ourselves? The poetry is dead. Like, we need a new form of poetry. We need a new form of expression. The old world's gone. That war was so horrific and it changed our lives so much, or our attitudes at least, that they had to find a new way to express themselves, and they invented rock. Well, jazz was, yeah, the Roaring Twenties was swing, and obviously he's talking about the swinging '60s. They take that name from jazz. Jazz is a hugely influential genre in this period, and a lot of people still listen to it, although it basically gets ruined by the advent of rock and roll, especially rock and roll sung by white people, and that is essentially a form of popular music, not really an underground thing. Yeah, and like you said, there were some programs that they tried to shove the pigeonhole that just ended up sort of backfiring. And they keep in mind that the English and the French were kind of bailed out of World War II. So I don't think I think they're losing relevance on the world stage, kind of pretty, slowly but surely at this point. And you could trace that back even to World War One if you really wanted to, but 1961, I believe. Yeah. Oh, by the way, just so you say this, all the cultural stuff that we're talking about actually uh antedates. Sorry. Yeah, antedates. Post dates. My fucking Latin Greek is just failing me, but it post dates the Berlin, what we're about to talk about, which is the Berlin Wall being built, and also the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's it didn't it was kind of this odd thing for and this is also my thesis is that rock and roll wouldn't exist if it weren't for the Berlin Wall, because it highlights the differences between this tyrannical totalitarian nightmare and then this sort of dream of liberality that may or may not be true, but it's this fantasy that people are engaging in. And I think that rock and roll wouldn't exist if it weren't for the Berlin Wall sort of being this literal emphasis that wedges those two ideologies apart and polarizes them. And famously, people try to escape, and and there's a lot of funny stories about that. Well, some people would try to cannon themselves over, and it just it got pretty goofy. And he was just called consolidating power at that point. Okay. So some background on that, and I do think that it's so crazy that they moved the missiles that close to American, you know, like heartland or whatever. But Turkey had a revolution in 1960, more of a coup really. But and they it's not, people don't talk about a lot anymore, but it kind of it was a change from the, sort of the spirit of the Young Turks and to something a little bit more sinister, a little bit more bureaucratic. And it was a military coup, if I'm not mistaken, kind of like the one that happened recently with Erdogan. Anyway, the after this, the U.S. gets really involved because of the Eisenhower doctrine. The U.S. is extremely interested in North Africa and the Middle East. It's sending money to Algeria and Egypt, and it's very interested in Turkey. Unsurprisingly. And they decided they can set up missiles with nuclear warheads in the Eastern Mediterranean, around about Turkey. I can't remember exactly where, but this pisses off Russia, and this predates the um, Cuban Missile Crisis. So Russia this retaliates by putting their muscles in Cuba. So if you think about it, they actually had just cause to do it. It wasn't just some radical thing they were doing, putting the missiles in Cuba. But um, it wasn't. It didn't end up being seen that way by the United States. Well, the reason, well, no, it wasn't it it wasn't that they agreed to remove it. It was because they had a standoff where they sent ships over, and they confronted the ships, and they were on the brink of war, kind of like Ukraine right now. Like, are they going to invade Ukraine, or are they not? And it was similar to that. Like, are they going to bring these nukes over to Cuba, or are we going to have to attack their warships with our own? And eventually they over the radio and phone calls they capitulated, and they sent their ships back home. But yeah, like you're saying, Khrushchev lost a lot of respect because of that. Yeah, and actually, this didn't deter the Soviets from stockpiling nuclear weapons. I believe in by 1986. I mean, that's decades later, but they had a peak, a stockpile of 45,000 warheads. Imagine how many planets you could destroy with 45,000 nuclear warheads. And they were stockpiling that. Yeah, so the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't deter, the arms race. And of course they had the SALT talks around this time too, which would turn into the START talks, but originally it was called SALT 1, SALT 2, which stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And those are talks that were geared to dissuade the two countries from overdeveloping and over stockpiling nuclear arms. But that happened. Okay, so the black and tans were a phenomenon in interwar period, where the British would sort of sail up to schlep up to Ireland and unload soldiers that would kind of crack the whip against dissenting Catholics that didn't want Northern Ireland to be part of the UK. They wanted to be part of Ireland, Republic of Ireland, I suppose. But the troubles was a sort of a obviously the black and tans leave, and then you have World War II, and then but the conflict doesn't cease. And I remember Ireland was neutral in World War II. They didn't give a shit about it in terms of foreign policy. So after World War II, Britain's in this economic hardship. It's not so great. The big cities like Birmingham are industrialized and gone to shit. But so they're not too involved with like cracking the whip on Ireland anymore. But that doesn't mean the Irish aren't going to stop fighting themselves. And so the troubles spring out where they start fighting. Northern Ireland's a part of the UK, and they're Protestant. And did you research this? Oh, okay, yeah, go for it. Go for it. Yeah, yeah. It's like the Republic of Ireland. They is what it's called. It has been called. But now they call themselves the Irish Republican Army because they think that the whole entire they represent. It's not the same as it's not actually the army of Ireland. It's basically a organized organized crime. Prague Spring. It sounds very French. It sounds like something that would not happen in the UK. Uh, and the other thing, before we I wanted to segue a little and talk about Spain right now, because Spain, just so people are aware, is still under the dictatorship of Franco, right? And that was going on since the 30s. And so, just for context, like Spain is right next to France, and it's in a similar has a similar leadership situation that it did, 30, 40 years ago. So I think France is, with all the, I think there's a lot more pressure up against on the borders of France and stuff than people might be aware of, and that's why this I think this May uh rebellion might look a little bit odd because of that. But if you factor in all the fucking geopolitical issues going on for France, I think it makes more sense that they're having this. Yeah, yeah, no. So Alexander, they very similar to Hungary. Czechoslovakia is a big Western oriented uh, Soviet country or republic under Soviet control. They don't like all the intense Soviet and communist policies that they're made to have, and so they start to. There's a guy called Alexander Dubček. I think that's how you say his name, and he said he led in '68 a reforms to sort of soften the communism in Czech Republic. Obviously, Moscow resists. Um, they're kind of on the brink of war. It ends up not culminating in war. There's a lot of emigration, people leaving the country of Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and there's also a lot of people, protesting in the streets. There's people lighting themselves on fire. There's vandalism at left and right. There's curfews are installed to keep people at bay, but the curfews are violated. And eventually, there's a peace talk that happens that's trying to reinstate the Warsaw Pact or revitalize it. And basically, the leaders of this, Alexander Dubček has to concede that the communist ideology is the one and true ideology, and he does. But then there's also this move towards like, hey, well, can we at least have communism? But communism, and we can have communism, right? But like, let's have communism with a human face, and that was the language they used. Was communism with a human face, and so they soft boiled communism, and they split Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia, and that lasted until today. And then years and years later, they would have another revolution called the Velvet Revolution, and Alexander Dubček was actually alive to witness this. And this was the last. This was the. This was basically the Czech Republic completely breaking away from the Soviet Union in '89. And later, Gorbachev would be asked, what's the difference between the reforms of Perestroika and Glasnost? Do they have any connection to this? The Prague Spring, and he says, yeah, no, the only difference is 19 years. And so he's saying that we're basically doing the exact same thing as the Prague Spring, but we're doing it with dismantling of the Soviet Union. No, 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 no. There was tensions on that though. Like there was friction, and they did make. Yeah, no, but you're right. You're right that you're you're right that they didn't go. There was no they didn't break out in a war, but they were trying to move away from the hardline communist policies that were in vogue at the time, or at least had regency. But he did have his. No, I mean, Dubček was successful. Like, let's not like slight him. I mean, he definitely got his most of his goals accomplished there, and it was yeah, it was. No, no, no. They split the country into Slovakia and Czechoslovakia. No, 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 no. The Velvet Revolution was them leaving the USSR. They did soften the policies in the Czech Republic, or so at this point, but it wasn't, and they didn't have to go up in arms like in Hungary. And the Hungary thing was more of a failure, I think. Yeah, yeah, it was the 60s version of the Budapest uprising. But yeah, what you were what were you trying to talk about next? Yeah, I'm sorry. What did you want me to talk about? Oh yeah, yeah. There's OPEC. Yeah, basically the Shah of Iran uh is deposed, and they get in the Ayatollah. No, but that was what led to a that's what further, I believe that's what furthered the oil crisis and made it worse. Yeah, so yeah, and then they go with the formation of OPEC because the Middle Eastern countries were tired of being bossed around by, these rich Western countries and getting really screwed over in oil when they know they can be charging more. And so, yeah, there was a coalition. Basically, it colluded to rise prices and kind of ruin the automotive industry in America. I mean, effectively, and also in Europe. And remember, Russian, Soviet cars, and German automobiles, British luxury cars. They're all pretty like they're all pretty effective. They're all great. And like when this happens, they're crushed by it too. I mean, there's environmental movements that are going on that the cars now have to be made with the catalytic converters because it eliminates greenhouse emissions to a significant extent, but not permanently, obviously. And then even before that, they banned lead. I mean, this is in the 50s, I think. They banned lead from the gasoline in cars, and that changed the way that you actually had to manufacture the engines and the exhaust systems. So cars are changing a lot. And one thing we didn't touch upon, but we should definitely mention is that television is in every fucking household now. And not just television, it's colored television. And not just movies aren't just being made, but movies with Technicolor being made or there's other formats there that have funny names, but I can't remember them right now. But the colored, and then um, analog tube televisions are being installed, but also music is being made with tube amplifiers with these giant cathode ray, contraptions that electrical engineers like. And this is sort of the defining media at the time. Radio is seen as a little bit of like this like old school medium, even though now, I mean, radio is still around even now, but like even then, like radio is seen as like kind of old. And in fact, radio almost seems like radio is old even when it was new. But this is besides the point. The media is changing tremendously. There's more and more movie theaters than ever, uh, and there's more music isn't about string quartets anymore. Music is about is electrified. Lead instruments aren't violins. Lead instruments are guitars or sometimes even keyboards that play. We can talk about the advent of electronic music at this time and the fusion of jazz with rock and the creation of prog rock. And with prog music, you have a lot of great electronic synthesizer stuff. Basically, synthesizer is basically an organ on LSD. It's electrified. It has different modules that make it sort of have a kaleidoscopic sound. So it kind of recursifies. It's a recursive version of an organ, and what we're talking about music is that you get these bands that from different parts of Europe that represent different cultures. In Italy, you have a lot of they make a lot. We're going to talk about film and music at the same time. I think in Italy they have a lot of horror movies coming out. Dario Argento is a famous one. Before that, you had neo-realism with Fellini and Roberto Rossellini, Michelangelo Antonioni, and then you had French New Wave in the '60s with uh, uh, Jean. I know these names. I don't know why I'm blanking. I am blanking, but you have Breathless, movies like Breathless, and movie by Jean-Luc Godard and Francois Truffaut, who was also a film critic. And in Germany, you had Expressionism and with Fritz Lang with M, but also I believe the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and who that wasn't Fritz Lang, but that was a German expressionist film. And then in France, or not trying to go back too far, but you Lumiere and stuff, but not trying to go Méliès, but not trying to go back too far with France. But and then so New Wave was sort of like it was a mid '60s kind of late '60s kind of film genre that came out of France, and they used minimal techniques. They didn't add a lot of music. It was low production value. They didn't have they tried to do they didn't have a lot of special effects. It was all, and they used a lot of funny camera angles and quick movements and stuff. It was kind of quirky, and this was a very new thing, a new fad at the time. Also, neorealism took the opposite approach. Neorealism came out of Italy, and neorealism's approach was we're going to make things seem as realistic as possible without losing that sort of grit that makes it captivating. And New Wave was sort of spaced out, but neorealism was kind of tuned in, and they had sort of opposite approaches. The and then in music, that's just film. In music, they had obviously in Germany they had a lot of prog music. In Yugoslavia, they would have a lot of great local music like jazz, but also folk music. And also they got really interested in funk music. There's a lot of great funk records, surprisingly, that came out of Yugoslavia. Well, and then postmodernism is sort of tangential to rock and roll and electronic music. It's sort of postmodernism is kind of a literary movement, but it's also an academic movement, and it has a lot of philosophical underpinnings. And postmodernism is you can kind of trace it to the Frankfurt School, which is a school that began before World War II, but certainly continued after. And it was an academic circle of prominent German and French thinkers, mostly German, to be honest with you. A lot of them were very, very interested in what society was turning into, and after the industrialization had sort of plateaued, and the service economy sort of came into the fore. And they by and large, this whole Frankfurt School out of Frankfurt, they kind of thought that they were pessimistic. They thought that modernization was bad, and they thought that it made people sort of lazy and have loose values, and it made people have less character and less humanity even. And some of the big wigs in that were Marcuse, you have Adorno, you have Walter Benjamin, you have Hannah Arendt, you have Horkheimer, Max Horkheimer. You have, and then there's only one guy still alive from the Frankfurt School, and he's actually a pretty good rationalist philosopher. He writes political philosophy. His name is Jürgen Habermas. But these guys, wait, are you? Wait, hold on a second. Hold on. You're not letting me. Let me go for the whole spiel. So this is sort of the German version of this, and there is some ties in here with Martin Heidegger, who was actually he was kind of there's a hubbub about him being a Nazi, but he was mostly a philosopher who just had some allegiance to the Nazi party. But despite him being a Nazi in the 40s, he was actually a very prominent philosopher that these people, all academic philosophers had to sort of pay homage to. It wasn't really a matter of politics. And among them were even French philosophers that didn't actually align with the Nazis. Some of them were communists even. One of those was the most famous among them would be Jean-Paul Sartre. But then you also have his girlfriend, who was a great philosopher in her own right, Simone de Beauvoir. And then you have their friend who wrote those famous existentialist books, novels, I should say, not treatises, but novels, and Albert Camus. And then on top of that, you have interesting existentialist thinkers like Georges Bataille, who have more of a more radical interpretation of existentialism. But Jean-Paul Sartre was sort of the main luminary in postmodern literature and philosophy. And Michel Foucault was a latter day sort of second generation version. He came around, who really hit his heyday in the 60s. And his view was that human sexuality was sort of constructed out of political forces and not biological ones. Well, yeah. And this is the thing, is that during this, he's not the only one who's thinking this, by the way. A lot of people at the time are moving against conventional psychiatric methods. You know, yeah, like, and you have, like, and you have Jean Piaget, and you have Jacques Lacan, and you have all these people who are, you might even still, what's his name, might still be alive. Uh, I forget his name, but he's an American, John Dewey. Doesn't matter. He's, when did John Dewey die? No, but but like he would have been like what Chomsky is now. Like Noam Chomsky is still alive. Of course, Noam Chomsky is also in this scene, sort of, but he's an American. He has different, more of a linguistic, rationalist approach, and he's not as concerned with sexuality as these guys are. But this is the thing: is that these sort of figures, it develops into, they kind of sort of lay the bedrock for not just post-structuralism and postmodernism. Another guy was a famous anthropologist, Levi Strauss. But they also have their own ideas they're worth looking into on their own right. And they each kind of tackle different topics. And it's all kind of based around Freud and Edmund Husserl, who was the original phenomenologist. Phenomenology was sort of a school of thought that basically was the predecessor, more than anything, to post-structuralism and postmodernism, post-formalism. And you have other writers that would merge later on, like Jean Baudrillard and Alain Badiou, and you have, even, who's the other guy that everyone knows, Roland Barthes. And those people should be, if you're listening to this podcast, you should have some dim awareness of who those people are, but you might not. So anyway, and so that's basically all I can say about post-structuralism, is that there's the dissolvement of order and a view of order as manipulation rather than as a natural fact. Wait, so I just, but what's up with, what did you think of, what do you know anything about this post? I don't want to jump too much into Portugal right now, because I think we can wait on that. what do you think about post modernism? No, I feel like if we're bringing it up, you should talk about it. Yeah, keep in mind that like not only is Francisco Franco running Spain as a dictator, but Italy at this point also still has a king. It- One thing we didn't talk about was what was going on in Greece at this time. Well, there was a civil war I mean, that we didn't mention, but it basically corresponded more with the last podcast and this one, although in the last one, okay. Yeah, I think we could table and I think we have so much content for this that we should do a part two. Because once we get into the 80s, there's just so much to say that I don't really want. No, no, don't do that yet. Don't do that yet. We'll start off with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on the next one. I have another podcast to do also, so I kind of have to go. Yeah, I mean we could call it more like 75, and then next one will be from 76 or whatever to. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks for joining us. I know it was a long one, but we like to think that we told a lot of interesting content. So I hope you guys take care out there.